Welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to learn about data classes. Data classes module provides decorator and functions for automatically generating dunder methods like init, repr, equals, etc. So let's begin with data class decorator. It automatically generates init, repr, equals, order methods like less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and hash dunder methods. So this is the constructor for data class decorator. It takes all the optional parameters, and let's see all the parameters meanings and their default value. When generating init method using data class decorator, the order of attributes that are defined in the constructor of the class is the same as the attributes defined inside the class for it, and it returns the same class on which the data class decorator is applied. So first parameter is init. Default it is set to true. If you are not providing this parameter, it will generate init method for the class, and if the init method is already defined inside the class, it is ignored. repr by default set to true, it will generate the repr dunder, and this parameter is ignored if it is manually defined inside the class. For equal to, if by default it is set to true, it will generate equals dunder, and it compares the value of attributes of instance with each other, same as we are defining that values inside a tuple object and comparing two tuple objects. Okay, and it is ignored if the class has already defined the equals dunder. Next is order. By default set to false. It does not define any of the comparison dunder method. If it is set to true, it generates all these comparison dunder methods: less than or equal to, greater than, and greater than or equal to. And if order is set to true and equal is set to false, it will raise value error. Next parameter is frozen. By default it is set to false. If set to true, attribute values of the class cannot be changed after the object is created. And if set attribute and delete attribute dunder is defined, this will raise type error. And it follows the same pattern as we create an immutable object. Next is unsafe hash. By default set to false. So this parameter will decide whether to generate a hash dunder for the class or not. So by default it's set to false, and it will generate a hash dunder if equal to and frozen are set to true. If the equal to is true and frozen is set to false, hash is not generated and it is set to none, because it is not safe to generate a hash value for the mutable object. So as we saw, the hash and equal to contracts in the dunder session, same rule applies here automatically by the Python. And when it is set to true, it generates hash dunder method even the objects are mutable. Okay, so this will set forcefully unsafe hash to true. And if you define manually hash method with set unsafe hash equal to true, it will raise type error. So let's define data class decorator. So when you are defining a default data class decorator, this all three declaration are same. So if you are not providing any parameter, without braces, or with all default values. they all generate the same class. So let's see the default behavior of data class decorator. So first here we have declared two attributes which are called as a field. It is not a class variable since it is defined with the type. So after the name of attribute, colon and the type of attribute, which will mark this variable as a field. It is interpreted by the data class decorator, which will take this attribute for the generation of the dunder methods. Okay, so here we have defined two attributes x and y, and this here you can also provide the default value in order to make this parameter optional. So simply defining this, it will automatically generate init method, repr method, okay, and equal to method. So these three parameters are set to true by default. So let's create class and its object. So three objects we have created. Now we will check the class definition or the dictionary object. So here we can see init repr, okay, and equal to. Hash will not be defined because we have not set the frozen equal to true. Because of that, it will not define the hash method for this. You can see dictionary contains two keys for the object point. So the attribute defined here are initialized as a instance attribute, and we can access those attributes using same as we have seen for the class and object. Now let's print the object, which will use repr method defined automatically by the data class decorator. We haven't explicitly defined any repr or str method. Same as we can use equals to method, which will compare the object of the point class. As we can see, point p1 and p3 contains the same value, so it is returning true. Same way you can also define typing for each of the field. So these are the typing which you can use to define the type of field. Now let's see the example to generate ordering dunder methods by setting order equal to true, which will generate all these four dunder method for comparison. And we know by default equals to is set to true, so we haven't changed that value, so it will automatically generate. So by default it will generate all these comparison dunders. Okay, now if we create collection of these objects and try to sort it, it will order as per their value. As we can see, it has sorted the default order into the sorted collection of points. Next is creating immutable objects. So by default, setting frozen equal to true makes object of that class immutable. And when you set frozen equal to true and by default equal to set to true, it will generate hash value. So unsafe hash equal to false will generate automatically hash dunder for this class. So let's create an object of that class. So now we have created object of that class. If we try to access the value is accessible, but if you try to modify it, it will tell you you cannot assign value to this field. Same way, if you try to invoke hash method, it will generate hash value automatically for the object of that class. Next topic is field. So until now we are configuring only the type of the attribute or instance attribute value for the data class. Now if you want more control, or if you want to configure per attribute basis, then we can use field. So field is a class level variable with the type annotation. When creating data class, it searches for fields in the class which are included in the dunder methods based on the configuration defined to it. So we can provide different configuration per attribute basis using this field constructor. Okay, so what are its parameter? Let's check out. So here in the constructor we can see one special value missing is a sentinel object, which is used to detect if the default and the default factory parameters are provided or not. So if it is not provided, this sentinel value will make sure that it is not given, which marks this attribute as a optional attribute. Okay, so first parameter default, if it is provided value, that particular value is set default for the field. So you can also provide in this field constructor, otherwise you can also provide here equal to and the default value too, but it has more parameters such as default factory. So for mutable object, you can provide here a 0 argument callable, which can be used to provide immutable object when this field is initialized. So such as a list. So if you have provided the type of attribute as a list, you can provide default factory as a list, which will automatically initialize this parameter as a new list object whenever the object of this class is created. Next is init. By default it is set to true for the field, which means that field will be included inside the init method. But if you want to exclude it from the init method, you can provide here false value. Same way for comparison, if it is set to true, that field will not be included into the equals to dunder method. And hash is default none, copies the value from the compare field. And if it is given true, this field is included in the hash dunder. And it is set to false when the compare equal to set to true when field contains the value which are expensive to calculate hash value. So in that particular case, compare to will be set to true and hash will be set to false. Next is metadata. It can be a mapping or none. If the mapping is given, it is exposed on the field object by making mapping read-only. So let's provide this parameter and see how they behaves. So first we will use default factory, which will provide you a list object, empty list object for each attribute when in the constructor that attribute is not provided. So for this example, class has one attribute students. So this will be included inside the init method as an optional parameter, and if that optional parameter is not provided, it will call this constructor list constructor, which will return an empty list object. So whenever you are creating an object of this class and you are not providing a list here, it will automatically assign empty list to this student's attribute. So after creating this object, you can directly extend list because it already contains the empty list. So this will not raise an error because even if we have not provided any list here, it contains empty list. So let's execute it. So as we can see, empty list is extended by the given list when it is not provided in the constructor. And if the list is given explicitly, it will assign that particular list object to this field. So in that case, it is extended by the existing list element. Okay. And here one thing to note is for mutable data type, if default factory is not used to assign direct instance, like for mutable object, if you are assigning like this, it is not allowed anymore. You must use this field to assign this default factory value. Now next example we will see excluding field from the equals to dunder. So here point class contains a color attribute which we don't want to include into the equals method, but we want to retain it for the init method. So we will set color str, it is a type of the field, equal to, we will assign field constructor, inside it we will set compare equal to false. So this field will not be included inside the equals dunder. So the 2-point object with different color but other attributes are same, if we compare it, it will return true. So this attribute is excluded from the comparison. Same can be done for the REPR, init and hash. So here if you provide for that attribute equal to false, that field will be excluded from this dunder methods. Next is default factory with init set to false. If the default factory defined here and field is excluded from the init, when object is instantiated, it will be initialized with the factory function. So even if it is excluded, this student's attribute from the init list, it will by default assign an object written by this factory function when creating an instance of a class. So here this class does not take any parameters, but when accessing attribute, we are extending the list set for the students directly without assigning it, because we have assigned default factory equal to list, which will by default set list for this student's attribute. So when we execute it, it will by default assign the empty list object to this students when creating object of this class, even though it is excluded from the init dunder. Next, we will see functions of DataClasses module. First is fields. It returns the tuple of field objects which are defined for the given class or the instance. So this class contains 3 fields, X, Y and color. So when invoked fields, it will return tuple object for each of these fields. So as you can see here, for each attribute X, Y and color, it returns the field with all of its parameter set for it. So these are the same parameter as we saw for the constructor of the field. Next is asDictionary. It returns the dictionary created from the instance. So for example, this class contains 3 attributes value, x, y, z and color and their value. So when asDictionary is invoked on the object, it will return dictionary containing the attribute and its value for the given instance. Next is astuple. It returns tuple of values of fields from the given instance. So it will only return the values for the given object. So here we will create two object of one is point and one is class. So class contains collection of object and point contains attributes. So as tuple is invoked, as we can see, it contains the value for the attributes in the order in which they are defined inside the class, and this is the collection which is held by this class object here. Next is make data class. It is a constructor which creates new data class with given arguments. So instead of defining a class and applying @dataclass decorator, you can simply invoke this method which will return a class definition with the given parameter, which has same meaning as we saw for the data class decorator. So it takes CLS name. It is a name of class which is returned by this function, and fields are the iterable containing the name of elements in this syntax, the name of parameter and the type of parameter, or name, type and the field with this parameter. So for example, here it contains iterable tuple object containing name, type. Okay, so from that it will construct the data class, and next parameter is basis. It defines the parent classes. So if you are inheriting from the parent class, then you can define here basis, and namespace containing mapping of method name and method. So if your class having method, then you can define here method. So here for example, we have defined a draw method and assign the method. Here method is assigned in terms of lambda expression, but you can also define a function outside here and assign that function to this mapping. Now when we invoke this function, it will return a class definition point from which we can create point objects. So let's create object of this class created from make data class method and invoke the draw method and print the object using the auto-generated REPR dunder. So as you can see, object is printed using auto-generated REPR, and it is invoking the method assigned to this namespace attribute. Next is data class. It returns true if given class or object of whose class is a data class. So it can be invoked on a class. It will return true if that class is created using data class, and same is can be invoked on an object of that class, which will return its class is a data class or not, and it will return false if the given class is not a data class. Next is post init. It is a post init processing dunder which is used for derived value which is assigned after the init method. So auto generated init method of data class calls the post init method if it is defined inside the class. So for the derived attributes such as, for example, this person's full name, which can be derived from the attributes first name and last name given inside the init method, so we can derive it inside the post init method, which will be automatically invoked after the init method is invoked. So we don't need to provide any invocation manually here for the data class. It will be automatically invoked. So let's execute it and see. So here we are creating object of the person class, providing first name and last name, and after initializing it will invoke this post init method which will assign the full name which is derived from the first and last name. So as we can see here, accessing the full name after creating object p1, it is having derived attribute full name with the given value of first name and last name. Next is init-only variables. It defines a pseudo field called as a init-only field which is used to initialize other parameters. And init-only fields are defined as an optional parameter of init dunder method and passed to the post init dunder. And it is not returned by the fields method when it is called on a class or the object of the class. So it will not be written by this field method. So the field which are not the attribute, which are not important for the class, those are marked as a init variable, which helps in the initializing or the checking the attribute values of the class. So for example, the class point contains a config attribute which is a init_var, which helps to initialize the point class object, which checks that if the color is not set using init method, it will derive from the optional parameter passed to it as named as a config. So from the config it will derive that color attribute and set it to the instance of the class. So this is the default constructor which takes 3 parameters. So this will set the color value to red, but when the config parameter is provided, it will invoke this post init method with this config provided to it, and it will check if color is not set, then it will derive from the parameter value passed to it and set the color value from the config. So let's invoke it. So as we can see, config is having one configuration. So for that configuration, we we are passing this config dictionary. So in the post init, when it checks that color attribute is not given inside the constructor or to the init method, it is not passed, then it will look for this value inside the config and derive the color from the given config, and it is set to it. So here, as we can see, it is containing blue. So when printing point P2, we can see that color attributes is set to blue, which is derived from the config. Because this attribute helps in initializing other parameters, it is not significant to class. That is why it is marked as a init variable. And when we are invoking fields method on the class, as we can see, it is not returning this init var config. So you can define or mark the attribute which are used to initialize the other parameter as a init var, which will not be included inside the fields method return value. So that brings us to end of the video.